Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information and free resources such as articles, case studies, videos, a self-assessment against the standard, and much, much more.
Hello, I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability. Welcome to podcast 3 in a series of 5 podcasts about human rights, business and supply chains. And I'm delighted to introduce Elise Gruel and Helen Carter. Elise and Helen, would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
So Elise, would you like to just tell us who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your background?
I'm a human rights lawyer. I started my career as a public defender, so my specialty was criminal law and really a public defender in criminal law for many years. I was also involved in the creation of the International Criminal Court, so I became a specialist in international criminal law. But now I work more as a human rights lawyer for the last 10 years, and especially in business and human rights, which is a new field of practice, which is now officially recognized in the legal classification by Chambers and Partners and other big law firms. So it is a real field of practice, which kind of marries different fields of law. We can get back to that. And I'm also an international mediator. I'm a member of 9 Bedford Row in London. So I think that's a connection to the UK that's worthy of mention. And I'm a lawyer licensed in France, in Canada, and also I'm a legal consultant with the New York Bar.
Thanks, Elise. So, Helen, would you like to follow that?
I don't think I can, to be brutally honest.
You can. You're doing yourself down.
But in terms of my experience, I'm obviously part of Action Sustainability. I've known Sean for a very long time because I've been with him virtually from the beginning on this one. I am actually procurement by background. I've sort of spent 3 decades working in procurement and supply chains. So that's the angle that I come to this from my perspective. I've been involved in sustainable procurement for about 20 years, but probably the last 10 ever since I picked up a piece of work for something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which some of you may be familiar with. I looked at modern slavery as part of that initially. Very much in those early days started to see it as this is something that's bubbling away and coming, needless to say why we're here today. Over those 10 years, I've been responsible for developing the school's approach to how we help with the construction industry. I've worked alongside businesses to understand how they look at particularly supply chain due diligence and best practice within this space. And this year was the launch of the British standard BS 25700, which is part of a standard, a free standard actually, that BSI have created to help organisations understand what they need to do to deal with modern slavery. I was part of the authoring committee and wrote particularly the procurement element of it. And I have the privilege of being the new head of the shadow committee for the UK for the new ISO standard that's going to be looked at over the next few years. So taking the British standard and taking that on. So whereas Elise has the legal framework, I have less of that, but much more around that sort of supply chain due diligence and engagement space.
We can move on to talk about practice, because we talk about the UN guiding principles, and I read them quite some time ago, and they're quite complex and big. It talks about nations and what nations need to do, and it's quite hard to translate that into business practice. And I know you both have a view on this. So if I can maybe start with Elise and ask you to talk about examples of some of the things that you've done around engagement, and also you talk about mediation in terms of kind of practically applying some of this good practice.
Well, if we step back for a second and thinking about the UNGP framework, which is really the standard right now in the world, and of course the OECD incorporated it in its chapter 4 on corporate activities, and then they developed the responsible business conduct in 2018, which is being revised right now, so it's going to be even more practical. It's extremely well done, that work, very informative. So the framework talks about the fact and the reason this framework was created was really to tackle the issues of supply chain in a world that was going globalized and that was creating a lot of problems. The French law was created with the same spirit, that the companies, the corporations have a responsibility to protect people against human rights abuse. And now it's extended to people on planet very clearly. The UNGPs don't talk about the environment, but the French law does, the European directive does, the Germans and the Norwegians do too. So the idea is to convey to corporate actors that they have not only to do process like they do so well, but there is a big change of paradigm. They're now responsible, recognizably responsible for what's affecting third parties, which is not the corporations. So, I mean, all the people, their employees and communities affected by projects, and everybody that can be affected by their activities in the form of causing, contributing, or linked by a business relationship, which is the vocabulary of the UNGPs and also of OECD, and again of the European directives. It's not that clear in the French law, but they have the same framework. So the first thing you have to map, you have to identify your risk, your severe risk to human rights, and then you have to prioritize them according to your activities. You're not responsible for risks that would have nothing to do with your activities, like natural disaster, for example. So, of course, you might be responsible for taking care of your people afterwards once there's been a disaster and all your factories are destroyed, but that's not the core of these due diligence law. So you have to look at your activities, your regions of operation, your sectors, and map the risk and classify the risk and hierarchize the risk. And then you have to prevent them. And if you cannot prevent them completely, you have to mitigate them, and then you have to remedy them. So you have to have grievance mechanism. This is the third pillar, and it's still very weak. It's a very weak third pillar at this stage. What's important is the change of paradigm. Corporate actors are used to doing due diligence on risk that matters to them, on their financial risk for shareholders and all that. They're not used to looking at risk to third parties, to people, and to the planet. That's something that's very hard for them to tackle. And in order to properly map these risks, my strong opinion is that you have to engage with stakeholders. Doing audit and certification is just not enough. I'll remind people there was an audit at Rana Plaza. I don't know what they saw, what they didn't see, but they certified the building and then it collapsed 3 weeks later. So, I mean, the only way you can do this work properly is to engage, and that is very hard to sell still. And I'm not even going to say that it's any element of bad faith. I think we need a lot of education and training and dialogue building to be able to understand the responsibilities of each parties and learning to dialogue and work well together. And this is not where we are right now. And of course, it has an impact on the business models we've been developing in this extremely capitalistic world of ours.
Yeah. Thanks, Elise. It's a massive change you've just described for organizations.
It is a massive change.
Absolutely. Helen,
do you agree with that, Helen?
Yeah. I was going to say, Helen, you mentioned in your introduction, Helen, that you're doing some work on, or you've done some work on the British standard. And now you're leading the UK Shadow Committee in developing an ISO standard on these things. How do standards help for people to understand what they need to do?
I agree with Elise in terms of, that there is still so much awareness needing to be done, still so much training. And over the sort of 8 or 9 years, I think I worked out the other day that I've reached out to 4,000 or 5,000 people in training and awareness around principles of forced labor and modern slavery. So that's great. But in most cases, whenever I do these things, I've not come across anybody who basically says, oh yeah, whatever. In fact, I might have come across 3 or 4 who've gone, yeah, whatever, it's not our issue, it's too far down the supply chain, walk on. Most people go, it's horrendous, what do we do? And there is although the OECD and the UNGPs are a great example, if we actually think about the big corporate global players, there are not as many of them as there are organizations embedded in the supply chain that need to actually undertake activity. And to go in with a UNGP or to go in with an OECD, you immediately get people going, oh, it's too big, it's too much. We're not that big a player. We're not a global actor. We might be a European actor or something along those lines. So when we were speaking back in November of 2018, we were talking to BSI about there needed to be some sort of standard. We very, very strongly said that it didn't have to be, or was not wanting to be, a standard that's auditable, because what we wanted to do was provide a framework that allowed businesses to think about that sort of shift in responsibility that's needed in an organization. And actually, the first step is to get businesses to even think about the fact that just because it's about supply chain, it's not just the sole responsibility of a procurement department, that it's got a much bigger footprint than that. So the framework was created specifically to allow people to think about, if I don't know where to start, here's something that I can do, and be used as almost like a milestone plan that can be given to organizations to say, you know what, your legal counsel might be up to space, or you haven't got legal counsel. Your procurement teams might be up to space, they might not be, but your board definitely needs to be considering these things. Your HR department needs to be thinking about this. And actually, your procurement is going to have a massive shift. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts that we need organizations to think about. It's getting all these actors in play, which is great. But from a procurement perspective, if it's not a brand, or if it's not something like a Tesla or an IBM, and they're definitely, managing to shirk a few responsibilities at the moment, you've still got challenges of businesses that are trying to deal with commodities that they don't understand, supply chains that they don't necessarily have any support to be able to manage. So it was getting them to think about, actually, procurement is a minute thing these days. Negotiating a cost reduction actually is almost becoming the least important thing of a procurement person, although I'm sure they'll tell me I'm wrong. But actually, there's this whole bundle of supply chain stuff that is now becoming part of that role that businesses are really going to have to try and adapt. So the standard was never created as an answer to say it ticks all your boxes. And we did strongly look at the UNGPs and the OECD to make sure that it aligned with that thinking. So it's very much about trying to sort of not dumb it down, but align it so that businesses can think about a practical way to implement that and use the framework as a long-term investment in how they can approach these issues.
So transparency is a huge issue within all of this, isn't it? I think you both talked about due diligence and supply chains, and certainly in most organizations, supply chains go deep and wide, all the way down to smaller businesses. And maybe Helen and then Elise, if I can ask you just to expand your thoughts on that, because certainly in my experience, this is an incredibly challenging and very expensive thing to even understand. Who's in your value chain? I mean, in some sectors, it's better understood than others, but certainly in our world, Helen, in construction, it's very hard to understand below tier 1 or 2 exactly what's going on.
And it comes down to the procurement models. It comes down to, and this is an interesting thing that Lisa's talking about, the definition of a business relationship. If you actually take that definition of a business relationship, you can probably stick it at, I know who my tier 1 is, and I know a lot of companies have gone down that. I know who my tier 1 is, and then gone, I've mapped my supply chain, and really not even understanding the basics of going beyond that. I think it's kind of interesting because I've looked at other sectors like the textile sector and cocoa, where you'd expect it's a single product that you're buying. Therefore, it's really straightforward for you to be able to map your supply chain and take responsibility. But I've spoken to the textile organizations who go, we can't map beyond tier 3. We're still struggling. And it seems to come down in the main to where it's a price sensitive item. And unfortunately, that's where you see most of the exploitation. So most exploitation and human rights issues are usually in areas where it's mass extraction, mass growth. So agriculture, in cotton, in a lot of the mining and extractive industries, where actually it doesn't make any sense to manage your supply chain because it's about bulking everything up. So some of the paradigm shift that we're talking about is actually about some of the economic models that are necessary to be able to start extracting. So if we're looking at polysilicon, for example, in solar panels, we need to be able to get much more transparency around that component material. We need to understand copper. And there's a lot of work in the mining industry trying to deal with these things, but it competes against the model of bulk it high, ship it in and get it into a hedge fund and get the cheapest price possible. So I think the huge challenges around transparency for me are namely the economic models we use in procurement actually disincentivize it. And some of the players don't want transparency because it keeps the cost levels down. I think the other issue is that procurement professionals now are expected to do a lot more than they maybe have the competency and capability to do around that specific. And it's a little bit of a Wild West. Talking as a consultant, I shouldn't say this, but it is a little bit of a Wild West in terms of people creating quick fixes and due diligence being seen as a compliance issue. So I'm going to give you a piece of software that will tick every box and give you a compliance that you have an assured supply chain. And the conversation needs to move to something much more responsible, which is almost like a find and fix. Our due diligence system is about not complying to say we don't have issues, because you will never do that, but that we have a responsible approach to managing our supply chains, preventing it, mitigating it, and then remediating it when we find it. They're massive changes for businesses to think about, and a huge challenge against transparency, I think, that businesses are finding.
Yeah, and because of their habit of dealing with their own due diligence about financial matters, they are used to ticking the box. They're using compliance officers, and that's what they do. They do it very well, but it just doesn't work for our kind of problems, the problems we're trying to tackle. If you take modern slavery, it's always hidden. So there's no box you can tick, because if you don't dig, you won't find it. I mean, You have to look for it very actively. So that's why you need to develop tools to look for it, and you need to raise awareness. How do you find it? Where is it located? What are the red flags that are enabling you to become aware and very active and looking for this phenomenon in your supply chain? The good news is that the supply chains that are covered by these laws do not stop at tier 1.
Yeah.
There was a lot of debate in the French law, and it's clear that it's the head office, but it's also its subsidiaries and its suppliers and subcontractors. And it's the same thing for the German law. And it's the same thing going even deeper for the European directive. So people, again, are going to have to work together to tackle that. I mean, you have NGOs that are so good at knowing the groundwork, the land, the area around these projects, and that you have unions that have contact on the ground that can relay the information. So if you want to find the information, I do believe you can find it, but they're not looking for it. They're just applying a formula of ticking the box and saying, look at all we do. And yes, they do a lot, but these are processes that do not produce the kind of result that we're in hope of achieving with all these laws. And it's kind of a bit of a waste in many instances of doing all that work and not getting to any results. And I mean, the NGOs are becoming sharper and sharper, and they're really on the watch and demanding results. And that's what I call societal pressure. That's, I believe, will produce results, but I mean, the sooner the better. In my opinion, because, I mean, the results we're seeing after 10, 12 years of the UNGPs are a much bigger awareness and a lot of process. But if we go on the ground, I'm not so sure that we're seeing that much improvement as we should.
I think one of the challenges there, Elise, is actually trying to marry, and I'm doing this at the moment with the solar panel guidance we're writing, and I call it the tripartite of responsibility, the sort of government, the business and the industry, and actually to tackle some of these issues. It's not about, and this is where I do have an element of sympathy for businesses, but they're demonized as they're totally responsible for what they're doing. And there are some really bad case studies of where businesses have been more than complicit, have been quite instrumental in some of the breaches that are going on. But the reality is that to a certain extent, their hands are tied in certain areas, and they need to be working much more constructively with industry and government to be able to start setting those levels of standards that they're looking for. And I think that means a much more of a maturer conversation around, not demonizing human rights, but actually, and modern slavery and exploitation, and even labor exploitation. No one looks and says, we've got no modern slavery right now on our doorstep. Thank you very much. And they're ignoring the amount of exploitation that's happening in what I call the softer level, that maybe the grayer area that's happening in this space. So it's almost trying to move it away. And I try to do this a lot when I speak to a lot of clients and say, it's just about people. What would you expect standards to be, and how far can you cascade that into a supply chain? And it's really interesting with the transparency conversation. You know, when Brexit happened, when the Ukraine and Russia happened, it was so amazing how quickly businesses were able to understand where products were coming from, where they were able to comply with the Russian sanctions, or whether they were able to understand some of the supply chain resilience issues. So we know they have capacity if they really try. But for some reason, when you start to then overlay some of these human rights bits, because I think they're worried about, am I ultimately culpable for what's going to be found? And have I got the leverage and have I got the influence to actually make any change? They just don't want to look. And I heard a very interesting debate saying that the transparency laws might end up with a situation, and we're finding this at the moment with some of the research we're doing. I think it's called bifurcation, where you fundamentally end up with two supply chains, a clean supply chain and a non-clean supply chain. The clean supply chain for those that are willing to look for it and pay for it and comply with all the requirements, but where human rights standards are less supported at a government level or in the country, where they can then trade with others that don't have the same compass as the Western developed economies do, or the developing economies that are trying to grow in this space, they'll happily go with the less clean, the tainted supply chain. And it's amazing for me how businesses can be that inventive over trying to find ways to meet legislation and standards and growth economies, whilst saying if you put that much effort into putting a solution that put the problem right in the first place, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. So it's an interesting dynamic, I think.
Well, if we go back to, you gave a very good example with sanctions. I agree with you. Most of corporations have been complying with sanctions because the consequences are so severe if they're caught not respecting these sanctions. I mean, both economically, reputationally, legally. I mean, the U.S. system, for example, is extremely, I don't want to say invasive, but certainly very, I can't find the word right now, but it's capable of acting, has a great power of action to take action against countries that are violating sanctions. And the sanction, the sentences, the economic impact is very big. So they will make the effort there. And of course, I mean, the sanctions, for example, in the Modern Slavery Act are not big enough. So they just don't feel they have to do it, because it does require an effort to look for something that you don't want to know is there. So, and transparency in supply chain is an extremely important tool, and they have to own it. They have to say, yes, we do want to know. I still believe education and training is extremely important. We can push that to the consumers. The consumers could also be a huge leverage on corporate actors to say, we do not accept buying these products. So that's a long-term work. I always tell my clients, we don't expect that everything is going to change overnight. What we expect is that you're aware of the problem and that you're doing something and that you're showing us a real effort to be on a continual improvement line and path. So if you get that already, you have something. And of course, when the grievance mechanisms start working properly, then the consequences will be more biting and people will want to do something about it. But it also needs to be presented as something motivational. And when I think of young people, they don't want to work for a corporate actor that's known to be a violator of human rights. They're not interested. So these corporations are losing a lot of talents in their attraction to young people, and that's also going to force a change. So it's a series of actions, some negative, some positive, and I think we need to use carrots and stick to change this world, and we need to develop incentives that are positive. I don't believe humans change just by the negative impact. If I think of criminal law, that's a very good example. I mean, you need to motivate people positively, and that's not something that's been done enough. And of course, the NGOs tend to shame and blame, which is extremely important. I'm not going to remove that from them. They've made huge headways with that. But at the same time, it's not always very motivational.
No,
so you want to avoid being named and shamed, and you're trying to hide. I mean, so it does trigger back that lack of transparency.
It does. And I think the other thing as well is the conflicting area at the moment. So I remember when the Modern Slavery Act came out, and I was at an event at the House of Lords where we were discussing the Modern Slavery Act and the transparency piece and the review that the government were doing around transparency and why was it not working. What I found really, really telling was I actually asked a question to the panel and said, how many procurement people are in this room? How many people are in this room that are supply chain people? And they said, okay, answer the question. And there was 3 of us in a room of 55 people. The rest of them were NGOs or government bodies that were trying to work out how to be able to deal with this. And I think there's still a lack of open dialogue between the various stakeholders that are coming in, because it's a subject matter that's so emotive. And whilst NGOs do a great job of raising awareness, they can also scare organizations into not having the best response, but have a reactive response. And then actually what you're trying to do is get clients to say, right, listen to the NGOs, but don't just listen to them. Listen to the businesses, listen to the government, listen to your stakeholders, and have a more collective approach, and then own it. That's the other problem, is that they won't own it because they see it as a compliance issue. They're constantly running to catch up rather than establishing, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing, and having transparency of thinking, transparency of how we got to this position, and having a debate. And it sounds idealistic, but it's where we need to get to for businesses to make real change, because otherwise what you'll also find, and this is obviously where we're going with Just Transition eventually, is that right now the human rights world is not yelling as loud as the net zero world. So, and we know that in the response to net zero, there's human rights being trampled all over the place in order to be able to provide so much of the materials needed. So trying to get businesses to think about owning it, thinking about actually how it has interdependencies and intersectional aspects across other business requirements, whether it's resilience or carbon or something along those lines, means that we've got much more of an opportunity to get it bedded as business as usual, whilst at the same time, like you say, using the big stick to make them realise some of the paradigm shift they might need to make to actually effectively make the change. And it's not just in human rights, actually. It's that they need to make a big paradigm shift in a lot of things to get things to be more sustainable.
Just to segue on what you just said, I do want to get to mediation and how it can be a powerful tool here. But before that, I mean, like 20 years ago, nobody was equating environmental issues with human rights. It seemed like, totally remote issues with no connection whatsoever. And now I think everybody is recognizing that any environmental violation will have a huge impact on human rights, on the livelihood of people, the water they drink, the land they cultivate, the air they breathe. And also when they're being moved out of their land, like a lot has happened in the mining sector. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has an impact both on people and the planet. So I do see very encouraging sign of this nexus being finally made in a powerful way. And we see it translated into these laws. These laws are all talking about, environment and people. It's different from your measurement standards that need to be established to control climate change. This is another area of environmental law that's just as important, but it's not the one that touches the people directly by the activities of corporate actors. And where mediation, and I would say before mediation, facilitation of dialogue and building consensus is so important. And there are so many people that are capable of doing that. You need to bring all these people together to talk about these issues, put all the issues on the table and say, we have this problem. How can we tackle it? How can we solve it? The solution will only come from building a positive dialogue in a space that people feel safe, they can open up, and when they're consulted about the solutions. Like, in mining projects, that's a good example. You had human rights impact assessment. They were conducted by engineers before digging a big hole that would change the life of a community forever. They were mandated to consult, but their definition of consultation was, to say the least, strange. So they would bring their report to a community in a far remote land, like in Peru, it happened a lot. And they would say, hey, people, we're coming to consult you. We have the 600-page report, fantastic report that gives us all the information about what we're trying to do. Please look at it. We'll come back in 2 weeks or in 6 weeks, and we'll discuss it with you. People didn't have the technical knowledge to be able to understand the first thing about the report, often the language, and they were not represented by people who had that expertise. So this was what you call a consultation that doesn't grant a corporation the social license to operate. They might have the legal license, but the social license is basically non-existent. And over the years, indigenous people, a lot in South America, started waking up with the help of unions and NGOs and human rights defenders to say, enough, we're not going to accept that. So it's evolving. And I often tell corporate actors, your best friends are these human rights defenders. Instead of finding them as a nuisance or an enemy of your corporate world, they detained all the information. If you talk to them, you'll know what's going on. If you keep trying to avoid them, you don't know what's going on.
I think what's quite interesting is, again, there's a real sort of gap here in terms of, where you've got these global organizations and corporates to a certain extent. They have human rights departments. They have people who can help understand how to translate that. You get further down into some organizations that are not playing on such a bigger scale. And, even the basic understanding of what human rights is not clearly understood. So, people understanding that, and I was working with one housing developer, helping them look at what they needed to think about in their human rights, and actually going through, the value chain, actually thinking about equality, thinking about, forced labor and exploitation, thinking about access to land and privacy, all of these sorts of aspects is probably still so new, and some will pick it up with other things that get talked about, like social value. Equality and diversity, social value. Right to employment is social value. And when you get down to the main, most people get so confused by terminology. What's human rights? Immediately, lack of education and awareness, as you've said, Elise, immediately brings you to the sort of politically correct environment rather than the actual reality of what human rights are. And I find that really fascinating when you try and get businesses to stop and take some time to think, well, what are human rights? What are the things that you should be considering, and how do they impact your business? And how do they impact you? How do they impact your everyday life and your family? And I think below the corporate veil, below the sort of the IBMs and the big global players, there's probably 10 years worth of behind in terms of advice, guidance and knowledge in this space. I think that's a big problem.
I'm stepping on to you're raising political correctness, which is certainly a big political issue right now, both on the right and on the left. I mean, it's absolutely preventing people from even having a decent conversation.
Yeah.
It's so true in the US, but I believe it's true in the UK also to a certain extent. This issue has been translated by corporations adopting great policies. They are very good at adopting policies, codes of conduct, talking about inclusiveness, talking about diversity, and even equality that needs to be seen. But so they think that by doing that, equality, inclusiveness, and diversity, they're tackling all human rights. I mean, these are important, but they do not cover like massive violations like modern slavery and all the other violations that we encounter. And so there again, I mean, political correctness has produced that result of a real impulse to do better against discrimination. But I tell them, there's a difference between, and that might be interesting to talk about that, between doing good, like in CSR, corporate social responsibility. You can have a magnificent policy, you're doing good work. But that's not what human rights due diligence it's all about. It's about doing no harm, making sure you're not causing harm by your activities. It's very different.
And I think that's really interesting, because we were having a conversation internally with some of our team recently around the definition of sustainability, and starting to see, the conflict between, well, there's sustainability, there's ESG, there's human rights, there's CSR. I mean, it's a little bit like, name bingo in terms of trying to come up with all these different elements. And I think that's the other problem for businesses, is how do they navigate all these different levers and understand. And the problem is that businesses just don't take time. There's nobody senior enough in most organizations. A global company will have a department where they'll see it as a compliance issue. Tell me I'm okay. Tell me I'm not exposed to anything. Right, that's it. It's done. It's not embedded in the way the business operates. It's just a department that keeps us clean, that keeps us legal, that makes sure there's nothing coming to bite us. But your sort of definition of do no harm and actually thinking about structurally how the business operates from a model perspective, and actually ESG has a part to play, but it's not, if I'm going down an ESG route, that's not my answer. If I'm going down a sustainability route, that gives me another answer. They're all parts of a jigsaw that's supposed to come together.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're all pieces of the jigsaw.
Yeah. And I think businesses, they're just getting there. I mean, I remember in the early days when I was doing, when I first joined AS with Sean and doing my first lots of carbon training, that getting people to even acknowledge climate change sort of 15 years ago was an uphill battle in most of the companies that we were talking to. Now I'm really fed up of hearing about it because everybody wants to suddenly jump on the carbon bandwagon. And you're like, yeah, but there's so much more now that you need to be thinking about. And there's much more out there, much more evidence, much more risk. And the human rights side of things is a very interesting dynamic with this sort of, I've heard from some clients where they've gone, I just need my solar panels, Helen. Just tell me how I can find a solar panel that I can find a tick that I've got no issues of forced labor and extreme political issues in there, because I'm not going to not buy solar panels because I need my net zero target. And they're real problems that they're trying to work out who's shouting the loudest and who do I then respond to, which shows a lack of investment and awareness.
That U.S. law that stems from an amendment in 2015 of the U.S. Trade Facility, it's called the U.S. Trade Facilitation Act, which amended the Trade Act of 1930. Obama decided to amend it to prevent the entrance into the United States of goods made by slave or child labor. It used to exist, but it had a caveat where you could surround it. If, for example, let's say chocolate, you proved that consumers wanted chocolate, you couldn't produce enough chocolate, so then you could accept chocolate that was produced in very discussable conditions and very troubling conditions. But he stopped that with that law in 2015. And it gave a lot of power to Custom and Border Patrol and NGOs who can raise it. And there's a report that's being done by the Department of Labor every month, a very thorough one on a yearly basis, but they improve it every month with new information. Yeah. So during the pandemic, they decided to confiscate the gloves, the medical gloves coming from Malaysia, thanks to the extraordinary work of a fantastic human rights defenders who's British, called Andy Hall. And Andy has been working in Malaysia, I think, for 10 years, and he really showed the link that these gloves that were so direly needed by the medical community during the pandemic, that they stopped it anyway. So when it comes to Uyghur, it goes even further because there's a reversal of burden. It's presumed that goods that are coming from that region are, made by slave labor. So to free them from the custom holding control, you have to demonstrate that they were not. It puts a big burden on the company. But that's a very efficient measure because if you don't know if your goods are going to come into the U.S., well, you do want to take your precautions because then you could get all your shipment impounded, and you don't want to see that. So it's having all these instruments together that is powerful. You don't have one that works better. You need to have them together. But if I come back to mediation, mediation is an extremely supple tool, a flexible tool. If you can bring people around the table and you have an issue, you try to look at creative way of solving the issue. The mediator doesn't impose conditions. The mediator facilitates looking for solutions outside the context of courts. And of course, it's much more efficient because it goes fast. You can always say, let's say we've solved 90% of the conflict, 10% is going to go to court because we need a decision on a legal issue. But you will have appeased the people. They will be appeased coming out of mediation. They will have more of a desire to work together, and your rights holder and victims will have a fast solution that's been negotiated in their favor. So This is very new that it's happening in the field of business and human rights, but I feel it's an extremely promising tool that we need to use more and more and more and more.
Yeah,
and hopefully it's going to happen. It can be a conflict, on ESG, for example. Companies won't agree on the meaning of S. Well, you bring an expert mediator on ESG. He will help the parties better understand what they have to do. Then they can keep on traveling their path. So it's a very creative tool. That's how you have to look at it. And it gives immense prerogatives to the person who knows how to use it well. And it's confined to rules and to very strict responsibility for the mediator.
And I think that shows a much more mature responsibility to really trying to get to the root cause of what the issues are and making sure that everybody feels they've got something from it. If it gets to a courtroom, you're not in that position to do it. It's really, is it the black or white of the law? And we know with something like human rights, there have been opportunities, what I tend to call the strategic litigation against the IBMs, the Dells, the Nestles. And there's one at the moment, I think, with the Findlay Tea Company where, that there are these civil cases that are being brought against the companies. And it depends on which jurisdiction you're in and which law you're applying to, whether it actually gains any traction or not. And actually, on a personal note, sometimes I like these cases because it starts to show how serious these things are becoming. Yeah. But at the same time, I sort of realized that actually something like a mediation is much more of a better way of being able to respond to this, because it actually puts the people undertaking the activity in the eyesight of the people who are being very negatively impacted by what's happening. And it putting a person perspective puts much more of a real application of solution to it, I think, which is really, really important. So I like that approach. I don't think I see much of it in the UK. The only case
it's totally new. It's only starting to be developed. I mean, very few people are doing it. In a nutshell, a court case, you have a winner and a loser.
Yeah, exactly.
And with all the consequences of winning and losing. In mediation, the philosophy, if it's a win-win process, everybody is winning. That's the difference.
Yeah, very much so.
Ladies, thank you very much for that really comprehensive and passionate overview in terms of what needs to be done, what best practice looks like in addressing human rights. This is podcast 3 of 5 in our series around these issues. So if you haven't listened to the others, please do so. I think you'll find them inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on sense and sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.